Hi, it's Susan from Worldpeacefull, and I'm reading the Canberra Times today, and the top of the news issue has been freedom of speech, which is, I think, the message of recent times, in the sense that it appears to be dovetailing with the change to our society in respect of moving from democratic freedom of speech to a much more controlled, a much more dictatorial society. And this comes with changing values. This comes with globalization. This comes with the blurring of the lines between the state and the business community and other governments. I think we're living in a world where those very essential values of respect, of fairness, integrity are being severely challenged. And as children grow up in a world of digital media, parents not being able to be home for kids, children in a sense being raised on programming, where the really deep ethical issues that are often role modelled in the community are really weakening. And I certainly remember when I was a child, we were put in line by people within the society. They would say something. If you said something that was disrespectful, someone you don't know would come up and say something. You might get on public transport. If you didn't say thank you, they would remind you of polite communication. So in a sense, those values were being upheld as the norms in that society. What we see today is everyone plugged in and ignoring each other. This is majorly problematic because people aren't having dialogues with strangers. People are not really knowing their community. People are seeking refuge in technology because they're trying to escape a world that may well for them feel out of control. Now, I'm doing this video because I feel very inspired by what I'm seeing in the papers. A couple of articles I want to discuss, and then I want to also go into a poem, which I might put on part 2 of this video. Now, the first article in the paper is very interesting. It's about freedom of information. So we'll start there. It's quite short. The heading is Senator Continues Pizzulo Stoush. Great word, Stoush. Most people won't know what that means. Senator Rex Patrick Stoush with Home Affairs Secretary Mike Pizzulo looks set to continue with the crossbencher taking aim over an ignored freedom of information request. The Home Affairs boss was censured by his minister, Peter Dutton, in June after Mr. Pizzulo phoned Senator Patrick in relation to comments he had made about the department's secretary in the media. Senator Patrick claimed Mr. Pizzulo had tried to intimidate him, and while Mr. Dutton backed his secretary, said the call was inappropriate. Following the controversy over the call, Senator Patrick sent a request to the department under Freedom of Information laws, asking for communications from Mr. Pizzulo regarding freedom of the press, balancing national security safeguards with press freedom safeguards, and media reporting regarding national security. While the request was acknowledged, no further response, including a time extension request, was received by the Centre Alliance senator, who has now requested a review by the Information Commissioner. On Wednesday night, Senator Patrick said he had made the request out of fairness because Mr. Pizzulo had taken umbrage at his claims he didn't support media scrutiny. After making the request to the Commission, the department responded explaining they were dealing with a high number of requests and pointing the Senator to public documents. So I don't know what comments were made in the media. But certainly the issue here is freedom of information requests not being processed. So possibly you're blocking, well, they're saying it's departmental delays. But the conflict here is about communication. It's about media scrutiny. It's about having full knowledge of communications that were sent regarding the issue. And it's about processing freedom of information. As a person trained in conflict resolution myself, without going into the nitty-gritty of this particular case, what I see is behaviours where people are not sitting down and dialoguing a problem. If a threat or intimidation has been made, well, clearly that's going to shut down communication. Then the problem escalates. So it escalates to a freedom of information request in this case. It then escalated into a newspaper article, and now it's escalated into myself reading this and then reporting it more publicly. So is that in the interests of the Home Affairs Secretary, Mike Pezzullo? Is that in the interests of Senator Rex Patrick? Is that in the interest of Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton? Or is it, a kind of a reflection of poor communication that could have been resolved quite easily by people coming together and talking about the problem? So freedom of speech is an issue with this, isn't it? And respect is another issue. So that's one article. The other one I want to talk about today, which is, I think, a really big one, is freedom of speech. I just want to premise this by saying that here in Australia, we don't have a Bill of Rights. We're a very, very weak constitution in respect of rights. We have all been taught that we are part of a democracy and that we are free to speak. Now, I'm going to read you a little bit out of this article, and it starts with the heading, Government Wins in High Court Over Twitter Posts. The nation's highest court, this is the High Court, has found the federal government's limit on freedom of free speech in the public service are conditional. Oh, sorry, I'll repeat that, are constitutional. Probably conditional too. It is conditional. In a decision that clears the way for punishments targeting bureaucrats who express political views. Key word there is punishment and targeting. Expressing political views is very, very interesting. High Court judges handed down the decision on Wednesday after a 6-year legal battle over Immigration Department's dismissal of ex-Public Affairs officer Michaela Banerjee for tweets critical of the government. Now, she's a public affairs public servant, which is very interesting. Attorney General Chris Porter last year applied for the court to hear the case after an appeals tribunal sided with Miss Banerjee when she sought compensation for post-traumatic stress following her 2013 sacking. High Court judges overturned the tribunal's decision and found that restrictions on public servant free speech were consistent with the Constitution's role maintaining an apolitical public service. Laws limiting freedom of expression in the bureaucracy were reasonably appropriate and in proportion to their purpose, judges said. Speaking outside the court, Ms. Banerjee said the decision was a loss for all public servants. And it's quoted, "It's not just a loss for me, it's a loss for all of us, and I'm very, very, very sorry." The finding vindicates the federal government in its restriction of free speech for public servants, confirming laws stopping bureaucrats from expressing political opinions do not contradict freedom of speech implied in the Constitution. The court also found the implied freedom of political communication in the Constitution was not the same as a personal right to free speech. Now, that's a really critical comment. It's implied, it's not a right. That's a problem for the public I'm just going to scan past all that. It's very problematic for public servants. Now, what was interesting about this case, and I'm just going to read this bit to you. Just a little bit about what actually happened there. It says the court's decision is a win for the federal and state governments, so it has extensive implications, and will clarify their limits in responding to public political comments from their staff. Ms. Banerjee was the author of tweets criticising the government's asylum seeker policies, written from 2012 under a pseudonym, Lal Eagle. La Legal, she's got, before she was detected and later outed by the Immigration Department. She was detected. They're looking at her tweets. So nothing's private, is it? She tweeted in her own time, except on one occasion, and didn't disclose any confidential information. I think that's critical. So she's not breaching any confidentiality in the Immigration Department. She's also not coming out as a public servant, therefore not identifying as one. Public wouldn't know she was one. And it's an absolutely impossible expectation for people to be apolitical when they've got, opinions, which everyone does in any case. And the issue here is her tweeting it publicly. From the government side, they're concerned about leaks. They're concerned about public relations. They're concerned about the tide turning against them as they wish to control the media. And that's actually a formal strategy in any organisation, whether it be government or private sector. They seek to manage public relations by press releases. They try their best to control the media. The same applies in warfare too. If you're in a war setting, they will manage the news to try and ensure that the public get a certain version of events. So even within public relations, we're not talking open and transparent speech. We're talking highly tailored speech that promotes that particular viewpoint. So it's not even public relations is not open to the other side. It doesn't provide comment like a journalist should do when they're reporting on something. I find that interesting. So what her comments were, which I found very interesting, was to do with the asylum seekers. Now, that's not only a political issue, it's actually an abuse issue. And I was thinking about that after I read this article, and I just thought, well, if you think an abuse is taking place, you should say something. I read today as well about how every adult should report any child abuse. Now, what if that abuse is taking place in a detention centre, which we know it has been? Detainees were sewing up their lips because of the, terrible desperation they were feeling, the psychological abuse and also physical abuse. We've got private contractors in these facilities, so we don't really know what's going on. And the thing is, I can't do a FOI request to Manus Island because it's a private company. So the privatisation of services that are really being paid for by the public is, I think, the key issue here. We've also got disclosure contracts, non-disclosure. We see in private sector, they get their staff to sign non-disclosure to protect brand image. And now that we're seeing governments like brand images, it's all the same thing, really. What we're seeing is they're being forced to sign non-disclosure. Now, she's very concerned about that because it means that the moment a person applies for a public sector job, they have to sign a non-disclosure, which means they forfeit their right, their political rights of freedom of speech. Now, when I was in the Centrelink system, I very much was told that I was not in equal partnership. I did speak up and I wrote a report called Compliance or Democracy, because what I saw happening was what I perceive as a regressive system in place of compliance, as distinct from a democratic two-way flow based on egalitarianism, which is equality. What I saw were edicts being imposed on me by a private sector company, and the outcome of which was ineffective. So I spoke up about that. I saw things like work for the dollar as a form of slavery. That's what I saw. I've been to bonded labour camps in India, and working for free in areas that do not produce work, in my opinion, is very questionable. It's like, well, why would you be working in an area that's not going to produce a job? That seems to me as a form of training to take any work without pay. And if you have no choice over that matter, then it becomes a form of slavery, which breaches international conventions. Now, I was cut off for speaking up, for airing my beliefs and my concern that a brave new world was arising. I was very clear about that I do not wish to live in a brave new world. That means a world where we have Big Brother, where there's too much scrutiny, where the public lose the right to say no. And we see that being trained into people with the IT sector in respect of iPhones, accessing websites. You have to say yes, you can't say no and still have access. So we're being taught to comply. And I believe the issue is actually a change in our political system based on changing values of those who are incumbent within it. I don't necessarily believe those people really appreciate the importance of democracy. What I'm learning as a citizen is I haven't yet participated in a full democracy yet. When I've written letters, I get standard letters back, but I never feel like my voice is valued. When I have critiqued, I haven't had a response that's addressed those questions, those grievances. As a person trained in conflict resolution, what I know is that if you don't sit at the table with someone as an equal and you let that other express themselves and then you respond to those issues with the intention of hearing and then clarifying what's being heard and then answering so that the other feels heard. These are very basic communication principles. And what it does is it de-escalates conflict. It validates the value of each person. It also creates a space of equality. But what I'm seeing in our world, and it's across the board, it's not even just in politics, it's everywhere, people don't sit in dialogue. They sit and make judgments. They assume they're right. They have their own perspectives, which they don't want questioned. So this sort of attitude of, I'm right, you're wrong, is pervasive in our society as well, because we've never learned to share the space properly. We don't know community. Even at work, we're all professional colleagues. These are not places that are communities where we get to know each other really well and we work as equals. Instead, we've got positional power. There's certain limits to what you can say and do because you're being paid. So we don't have the experience of democracy at work. There were attempts many, many years ago to create industrial democracy, and also other formulations which were employees having shares in that organisation so they have a say. So that whole issue of respect, inclusivity, community is not happening in professional or business or government type situations. There might be lip service given to it, but on the whole, you can tell on the ground whether you're actually really seriously being seen as equal or not. So we have a lot of confusion, I think, around all of this. There are real implications for the public servants, because if they really do see that abuse issues are occurring within government and there's some really strong values being challenged, I mean, is it okay to put a person who's fleeing persecution or is alleging they're fleeing persecution, who's come in on a boat, that in itself is perilous? Is it appropriate to put them in a jail? I've been in a detention centre myself, and it was a maximum security jail, and there was children there. How appropriate is that for those people, given they've committed no crime? Why is it that they weren't able to find refuge in a first country? The fact that they've made it to this country, why do we send them off to an island or islands, Christmas Island, Manus Island, Carew? And how many of them are there without any knowing of when they're going to be processed? So there's psychological abuse issues. The woman in the public sector issue, she spoke about post-traumatic stress disorder. I call that a form of psychological abuse. I'm just sitting with it for a moment because I'm thinking of soldiers too, because they often talk about that. Person's gone through trauma. Often the trauma is about not being heard. Or it could be, in the case of soldiers, they're going through, I think, great fear is what's coming to me, great fear. When you're in a court situation, you're undergoing great fear. Now, this battle went on for 6 years. That would have drained her financially, and she has to pay costs. So that's a punishment in itself. And she's standing on principle. I was told in a court by a judge that he said along the lines of, a lot of people on principle get chewed up and spat out in this system. But where else? I mean, in this lady's case, she went to a tribunal and it was in her favour, but she got pursued to a higher court. I mean, is that fair? Should a person have to go through 6 years in a case where she's believing she's got the right to freedom of speech, and then to have this a government who've got endless resources win the case, and then she has to pay their costs? What is that going to do to other public sector employees? What if they see abuses? Are they going to all stay silent? They will, because they'll be too scared. So the real loss in this particular situation is, again, the fear that people feel that's been. So this is intimidation because of this outcome. So the courts, in a sense, have imposed a finding on a person who's speaking publicly out of conscience because she's worried about the well-being of people in detention. That would be the essence. Why should a person be punished for that, given that she's not revealed anything from that department? She's also done it under a pseudonym. Now, how is that a problem? When lots of people are talking about detention centres, a lot of people don't know who they are. The difference here is that it's against a government, in my opinion. That, to me, is the core issue. They're not liking that going out into the media. I just want to sit with this for a moment because I think it's extremely important. I'm just going to go still. This is what I usually do on my videos. The key issue in respect of the law is the implied freedom of speech, but we have not been given the right to freedom of speech. That's the political, legal issue. The human issue is conscience, speaking out of conscience because you feel something is wrong. You feel people are being hurt. The law doesn't seem to be able to deal very well with social, emotional abuse issues. And I've certainly witnessed this firsthand in my own experience. We also have communication styles of undermining other people we don't agree with, rather than seeking to solve that problem. It takes a lot of courage to take on a government in respect of the Australian Constitution, which I think is not strong enough. I think we need a Bill of Rights here in Australia, definitely. It is the nature of all human beings to need to express themselves. So how does that wash with subject matters where we've seen religious statements made that have vilified a group in the belief that they will go to hell? I personally believe in transparency. I personally believe that those freedoms of speech should be honoured, whether you agree with the person or not, because when it goes out into the public then can respond to that, and that person can learn from their peers. I don't believe people should be shut down or sacked for having an opinion. Now, let's say that opinion incites violence. What then? Did they come into that with the intention of inciting violence? Or unwittingly say something they didn't realise would amount to inciting of violence? These are the questions for society. Do we shut down everything that we think is wrong? Do we shut down everything that we disagree with? When it's aired, we have an opportunity to deal with the problem. In the conflict resolution area, the idea would be to bring the parties together and to get them to express the truth of the matter from their perspectives, then to find a middle ground where they can live and work together. Because at some point we have to compromise. You can't just go through life saying, you all can just go eat cake. I'm going to say what I want. I don't care about you. There has to be the respect that, and also the awareness within ourselves that what we might say might harm someone. I've heard some discourses around the acceptance of child abuse. That really worried me when I heard that. But do you know what? Those voices were silent in the past. They're feeling more confident to come out. We have the implied perception of, white supremacists, or the anti-Muslim statements. So what we're seeing is prejudices being aired. If we didn't have interference in respect of the press, and that is ownership type influences, I would probably be in the position of, I do think people should speak up, but I do think that we don't want to vilify or discriminate against people either. That's why we have an Anti-Discrimination Act. It's to protect so there's not mobbing. We don't get mobbing. One could enter into a discussion in a public sense that's an intelligent discussion where someone could explain why they hold the views they hold. I think that's a good idea. So look, this is a moral type area and it's a values area. So it's fraught with contention. But I guess as a summary to this discussion that I'm just entering into, what I'm feeling is a prevailing shift, which is the removal of freedom of speech. I see the dismantling of a democratic society in process. Now, the outcome of all of that is very concerning, because what holds that society together is the belief in those freedoms. If there's a loss of belief in the freedoms, people will say, well, what's life worth? You know? So it's a very much a concern, but at the same time, I suppose if you don't value democracy, you need to go through a process of relearning why democracy was formulated in the first place. And it came out of dictatorial and harsh repression. So maybe we're coming back full circle. Maybe that's the lesson we're here all to learn again. It is what it is. And I just, all I can say from my perspective is that I'm always going to speak up. And if there is a consequence to that, that's okay. I accept that consequence, because the life that has meaning and value for me is one of freedom of speech, is transparency. And I just don't think I could stay silent if I think something is wrong. So the consequence is the consequence. But I'm not going to personally let fear stop me from speaking. Love will always push me to speak, and that's who I am. So with that, I send love, and I will read a poem out for you in a moment. Next video is my poem. Bye.